Well, welcome to ATG, the podcast. Today we're talking to Richard Sever, who's Assistant Director of the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory Press in New York and has recently been appointed Chief Science and Strategy Officer of bioRxiv, which is a new independent organization to oversee the preprint services bioRxiv and medRxiv. So welcome, Richard, and very good to talk to you.
Hi.
Can we start with your background? Tell me, how did you get interested in science in the first place?
How do I get interested in science? I'm not sure I would point to any one particular incident, but I always was from as young as I can remember. I think it was more the sense of trying to figure out how things worked. I've always had this kind of thing in my mind. If I'm when I was little and I didn't understand how a car worked, it was really important to me, for example, to understand what the internal combustion engine was and how it worked. And I even, sort of decades later, I continue to get frustrated if there's something and I don't understand how it works. I need to understand how it works. And so I think that's kind of what the scientific mind is like. And so when I was in school, it was clear to me that the subjects that I gravitated towards were math, physics, chemistry, and to a lesser extent biology, ironically. Um, and that was a way of kind of like finding out how the world worked. And then I think as I went through high school, physics and chemistry in particular became a real fascination for me because they really, once you did begin to understand how things worked, how the world worked, it was really intriguing. And there are a couple of moments that I remember in my high school life which were kind of wow moments, and I really want to know more about this is what I want to do. And I think one of them was in chemistry when we started doing the quantum world, and that was a real kind of eye-opening moment. It's like things are really different down there, and I want to understand it. And then on the chemistry side, when I started doing organic chemistry, I'm beginning to see where those two worlds fit together with things like benzene rings. And then right towards the end of high school, doing the beginning to understand what biochemistry was, what um, nucleotides were, and how DNA worked, and that was the point when I was like, "This is the thing that I want to do." And so then I went on and did an undergrad in biochemistry at Oxford, and I think everything focused on that really. So
Fascinating. So, and then you focused even further on when your PhD, which is also on molecular biology, I think.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I was very fortunate to have a great undergraduate advisor called Sue Kingsman at Oxford, and well, I was kind of lucky enough to do well as an undergrad, and so the opportunity presented itself to go and do a PhD. And she essentially said, there's three places that you should go. The Institute of Molecular Medicine in Oxford, ICRF in London, or the LMB in Cambridge, the Laboratory of Molecular Biology, um, with all those Nobel Prize winners. And since I'd grown up in London, had been undergrad in Oxford, Cambridge appealed as something, not massively different, but at least different. And so, yeah, I went and did PhD in molecular biology there. And of course, that was an incredible place to be because you had Aaron Klug, Mats Perutz, and I was a joke that, when people say, are you nervous about giving talks in public? And actually, I never am, because the first talk I had to give was as a new PhD student, and I think there were five Nobel Prize winners in the front row. So once you've gone through that, then pretty much any other audience is not going to be quite so challenging.
Gosh, but then you had a sudden sort of turnaround because did you do any lab research after your PhD?
No, well, I mean, I was lucky in that I'd done as between undergrad. Well, in fact, between high school and undergrad, I had worked in a pharmacology lab for a bit, on a gap year. Then I in the vacations, when I was an undergrad, I'd worked in an immunology and a path lab, and obviously then I did my PhD. So I'd had quite a lot of research experience by that point, and I think I don't think it was a sudden decision. I always viewed the PhD as something that was keeping my options open, and I suspected it would be really good for whatever I chose to do next. So I think towards from the, I guess halfway through my PhD, I was already trying to figure out what I was going to do. But it was pretty clear to me earlier on that I didn't want to be an academic researcher. I mean, I was not enthralled by working at the bench like a lot of people, but it was also very narrow. That the academic sort of focus was incredibly sort of deep, and not so broad, and I kind of was trying to figure out what was a way to go back to the breadth that I'd had as an undergraduate. And so that was when I started thinking about working as an editor or a journalist or something like that. So there was a process towards the end of my PhD, and just after I finished, when I was trying to work out, do I want to be a science journalist? Do I want to be a science editor? And at what level do I want to kind of pitch myself? And I think one really fantastic experience, and again, I was incredibly lucky at Cambridge to do this, was within the tutorial system. I taught undergraduates one-on-one, and so that was really nice. And I was like that, being able to, in one week we'd be covering bioenergetics and the respiratory chain. The next we'd be covering oncogenes, and I thought, this is good. I like this breadth. And the more I thought about it, the more kind of like being a scientific editor made sense, as opposed to a journalist where you've got the sort of 50,000-foot view, and you're really having to make things a lot more basic for a lay audience. And I mean, that's an incredible skill, and I thought that's probably not for me. I want to I've gone all the way through to this PhD. I want to continue at that level rather than kind of draw back. And that's essentially what took me into scientific publishing.
So is that where you chose? It's interesting you chose review journals rather than sort of standard scientific journals as your first publishing work.
Yeah, I think it was. So I was at Current Opinion in Biology and Trends in Biochemical Sciences. And I loved that because it was like being paid to be an undergraduate. It's like being paid to be an undergraduate and kind of doing it better, because I mean, we all know what undergraduates are like. I didn't work particularly hard all the time. I cut a few corners, but being a review journal editor was great because you could really get into depth in one week you're dealing with photosystem 2 and in plant biology. Then the next you're talking about homologous recombination and DNA rearrangements, and and it was fascinating. And I think what a lot of editors, and particularly review editors, find is there's just something innate in you where you really like working with an author to make a paper better. And so that was the first part of my job, was being trained as essentially a developmental editor to take copy and make it better and work with somebody to create the best possible article. And then of course what comes along with that later, as you become more experienced, is getting involved in commissioning and being the person who decides what the articles in the journal are going to be. And so that's what I moved to when I moved to Journal of Cell Science. After those two experiences, I was executive editor there, and that was a great experience because there was essentially two facets to it. One was continuing as a reviews editor, but making decisions in the Cell Biology Journal about what we would cover, who I wanted to write on a subject. And so, over a period there, I commissioned hundreds of articles and worked with, hundreds of authors on them. And I really enjoyed that. But that opportunity gave me the chance to see the other side of publishing, which was the logistics of how a journal runs, because this was a primary journal. So we did have reviews that I handled, but we also had 10 academic editors who were dealing with, the weekly deluge of submissions of primary research articles. And so I got to learn about how that process worked, oversee it, and from the kind of academic side, seeing the interplay between editors and peer reviewers, the decision-making process, and think about how that could and should work, and then the more sort of technical aspects of publishing, because this was at a time when people were really moving everything online, thinking about online systems. What should articles look like in an online world? And I mean, we're still debating that right now, but it was an interesting time to be part of that and learn about how the kind of mechanics of journals worked. And I think that sort of informed a lot of the things that I did subsequently.
And then you moved from what's probably the largest academic publisher from Elsevier to one of the smallest, to the Company of Biologists, which is just a handful of journals. That must have been a contrast.
Yeah, it was. Well, I mean, Journal of Cell Science was where it was at the Company of Biologists.
Yep.
But yeah, that was. And so that, I mean, I think that's something that I found throughout my career is that, if you're at a big organization, there are lots of benefits to that. You often, you can, there's a sort of professionalism, which is, you learn things very quickly. You're taught the right ways to do things, and you get a lot of experience doing different things because the organization is big enough to offer you those opportunities. On the other hand, a lot of what you do is dictated from above and fairly constrained, and ultimately you're in service of that company. And so moving the Company of Biologists was fascinating because it was a non-profit organization. It's their mission is in service of science. So that was really fantastic. There's a lot more freedom there to do new things. It was a great place to be, where if you had an idea and you could pitch it to the directors, frequently they'd say, "Sure, go ahead." And it's much harder to do that in a giant multinational organization. So that was fantastic. And I continue to admire the Company of Biologists. They're a fantastic group of people. And that was really, really good fun. And I made a lot of friends there. And that was the place where I did a lot of commissioning. And so really began to get to know a very broad spectrum of the sort of scientists within the biomedical community. And learn a lot more and learn about cell biology, which, I mean, I was a sort of molecular biologist, biochemist. There was lots of aspects of biological sciences, cell and developmental biology, that I didn't know so well. So getting to know the people in that community, getting to know how those fields were progressing was really great. So, another example of you just keep expanding your scientific knowledge. So it was fantastic. And I was there for 8 years.
And then the move to Cold Spring Harbor Press.
Yeah. So that was funny. That was a second time lucky, because actually John Inglis, who's the executive director of Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory Press, we had bumped into each other, I think, at American Society for Cell Biology meetings, which I would attend every year and he would attend every year. And we'd met then, and we'd always talk. And at one point he said to me, I can't remember, it was like about 2003 or something. He said, "Oh, we're looking for editors. Would you like to come over to New York?" And at the time I said no, because I felt that, the project that I was running at Company Biologist was not complete. There was still a lot of things that I wanted to do. And then, funnily enough, a few years later, I bumped into him again at an ASCB meeting, and he said, "Have you got itchy feet yet?" And then I said, "Well, maybe I have." And that was interesting. And I kind of think it's one of those things that does happen in careers, where I felt that it wasn't that I plateaued, but I felt like, I was at a point where a lot of the stuff that I wanted to do at Company of Biologists I had done, and that it was a good time to move on to a new challenge. And then, of course, that was great, because it meant that I vacated this position at Company of Biologists that somebody else could step into, and they could then have the experience that I'd had and learn all this stuff. So that was 2008 when I moved to New York. And that was in some respects, it was a little bit like when I joined Company Biologist, in that the person who was recruiting me, part of what they were saying is, "Come here, have ideas, and let's do things," rather than just take over the steering of an existing ship, if you see what I mean. So that was really nice, because it was kind of vague about what John wanted me to do. I remember there was this vague talk about books, but we kind of both knew that books, whatever we meant by books, was probably changing, and there would be lots of different things. And so, I remember actually one of the academic editors at Journal of Cell Science saying, "You're going to New York to work on books. Why would you want to do that?" And I think it was because I knew that it really wasn't going to be that. And of course, it went on to be many different things: journals, some books, in fact, and preprint servers. So
Mm.
yeah.
So Cold Spring Harbor is fascinating. It's one of the biggest research labs, but also, yes, as you say, has a publishing program and educational initiatives. It sounds very unusual.
Yeah, it is, and I think I think that was critical to a lot of what we went on to do later. In that, Company Biologist was very different from a publishing company because it was non-profit, run by scientists with the aim of kind of furthering the interests of science. And then Cold Spring Harbor is like another step further in that it's like, as you say, it's this research institute, with amazing scientists. It's frequently ranked like number one in the world, and whatever metric you choose. So you're really surrounded by all these incredible scientists in everything from genomics to plant biology to neuroscience. Plus, it's like this sort of communication hub for world biomedical science and genetics, because I think the number is something like 8,000 people come through every year to all the Cold Spring Harbor meetings. So, if you're on campus in the summer, one week you've got 500 bioinformaticians wandering around, and then the next week there'll be a bunch of cancer biologists, and then the following week you'll see lots of people wandering around with badges who are all talking about cognition. So I don't think that there really isn't anywhere else in the world like that. So it's really a pretty inspiring place. Plus, of course, there's various other education initiatives and the press which has done things like, have some regular journals like Genes and Development and Genome Research, but then also published this book, Molecular Cloning, which was a guide to doing molecular biology that basically every lab in the world had. When I was a PhD student, we had Molecular Cloning, the 3 volumes on the wall, and basically every lab in our building in the LNB had that. And that came from Cold Spring Harbor because Joe Sambrook had been there. He was one of the authors, and the other one was Tom Maniatis. And so, most of the, funnily enough, most of the world knows that book as, inverted commas, Maniatis, but actually it was really Joe Sambrook who did most of it. But that's inevitably quite an inspiring place to be, and because of it being that sort of nexus of academic work and communication and publishing, it was a really good place to do new things and get feedback on what might be good or bad ideas. And I probably had as many bad ideas as I've had good ideas.
So it was a very wide-ranging place, but even so, why would a research lab set up a preprint server?
Well, I think it's back to the fact that it was felt to be a good idea and good for science. So and it was certainly not a given. John and I have talked about this loads, but the thing that we always talk about is, it wasn't the preprint server wasn't a particularly original idea, in that, arXiv had been going since 1991 incredibly successfully in physics. And there had been sort of these conversations for many years about, why wasn't there an arXiv for biology? And people had kind of tried to start things like this, mainly more on the commercial side, and hadn't really been very successful. Most of them were sort of full of garbage, and there was this general sort of feeling among a lot of people in the community that the biology was slightly different, and that the physics, the culture was different, the nature of the experiments and the nature of proof was different. Everything was sort of self-evident in physics, and that this was why it worked. Which, of course, once you start talking to a physicist, they say that's utter nonsense. And you realize that all the things that you say about biology, about it being competitive, about, it being kind of, it being murky, it being difficult, the physicists say it's all the same thing. And we were lucky enough at Cold Spring Harbor to have that, because there'd been a move of people from computational science, physics, and math into biology. We had faculty at Cold Spring Harbor who we could talk to about this. and they would say, I mean, one of them literally said to me, you know, when they first arrived as a sort of faculty member in a biology department, they were like, where's the archive for biology? And were astounded to find that there wasn't one. And they just thought this was naive and stupid of the community not to have one. So when you talk to people like that, you really got the sense that there could be something like this. So what had made these other efforts fail? How might things be different? And I think there was a huge amount of right place, right time going on there. So, I mean, as I said, John and I talked about it, and I remember sort of saying to him, "Oh, you know, I've been kind of watching a lot of the discussion among the genetics community. I think it might be time to do this." And so we had this, you know, his response again was like, well why now? You know, why is this thing that's never worked for anybody going to work for us? Why should we do it? And we took more and more about it, and we thought, well, things were changing. You know, the ability, I mean, in hindsight, I think one of the things that was important was the ability of scientists to interact with each other independently on social media, on Twitter in particular. And so people getting recommendations of articles to read based on what their peers were reading at a kind of level, a network level that hadn't happened before. So I think that was part of it. And I think the fact that it came from a lab made a huge difference. And, you know, people knew what Cold Spring Harbor was. They knew that this wasn't some venture capital funded thing where somebody was trying to make a quick buck. This was something kind of born out of the scientific community, and a lot of people. So we had a lot of supporters from the get-go. And I think the fact that it happened at Cold Spring Harbor Lab, the fact that a lot of the conversations happened around at this big meeting called the Biology of Genomes at Cold Spring Harbor, where we gathered a bunch of geneticists together and said, okay, what do you think? Should we do this? And they were all like, yeah, you should totally do it. So I think, you know, that was important. And another key, I mean, back to your original question about doing it at a lab, I think one of the critical things was the endorsement of the president of the lab, Bruce Stillman. So we took the idea to him, and, you know, I mean, I think John and I were both pretty nervous about this because, you know, he might say, well, why are we doing it? You know, we don't want to do this. You know, how's it going to work? The community doesn't need this. But actually, he was enthusiastic about it and became a really big advocate. And so the fact that who's, you know, I mean, he's a practicing scientist, works on DNA replication, runs this huge research institute, and he thought it was a good idea. And he's not a science publisher or anything like that. So we thought, well, we'll give it a go. And it was pretty amazing that, as I say, it seemed like the right place and the right time, because it pretty rapidly built a group of really enthusiastic advocates, mainly early career researchers who, you know, they didn't have so much inertia.
So there was bioRxiv, but you didn't set it up, just to clarify, it didn't follow any different ground rules to archive, the same kind of process of how a preprint server works. Is that correct?
Yeah. So, I mean, we spoke very early on, and when we had the launch advisory board, Paul Ginsberg, who was the founder of arXiv, was on that, and we talked to him about it. I mean, we mainly talked to him because we didn't want to feel like we were treading on anybody's toes, and we wanted arXiv to be okay with this. And there's a sort of, you know, a little bit of history that some people aren't aware of. The spelling of bioRxiv is different, intentionally, from arXiv. And that was because when we spoke to them, they were, I think, very reasonably worried that if we spelt it the same way, bioRxiv, then given the potential in the biomedical community, the size of that community, they were worried that they might end up having to do customer support because people would think bioRxiv was part of arXiv. So we said, okay, well, if we'll get rid of the A and we'll make a big R rather than a big chi, and sort of brand it slightly differently in a way to avoid that confusion. But for the most, in many respects, we did follow their process, which was we had scientists look at every paper, and, you know, not peer reviewed, you know, but screen the papers. And our process is slightly different from theirs, I think, because we felt the structure of biomedical community was slightly different. You can endorse people on arXiv, which we don't do in bioRxiv. But everything was screened, and we had the same sort of rule of thumb, just trying to eliminate things that are pseudoscience, nonsense, non-science, and of course and things that might be dangerous, which is but all of that is a tiny percentage, and then just acclimatize the community to the fact that they're reading papers that have not been peer reviewed. Nobody claims to have certified these things in any way other than the authors, and so I think it was getting people used to that. And if I again back to Bruce Stillman, I remember conversations with faculty where people were like, oh, these things are going out and, they're not peer reviewed. And Bruce said, well, every time you go to a conference and hear somebody talk or look at a poster, it's not peer reviewed. So I think once people realized that they were doing this anyway, it wasn't such a radical step. I mean, I think it's more radical than for funders and people like that who want to count publications and think that those publications mean something without having to read them. And that's a whole nother discussion to have. But I think, it was very much inspired by arXiv and very much a similar process overall.
But you then felt the need to have yet another system when you founded medRxiv.
Yeah, well, yes, and I mean, I think almost as soon as we founded bioRxiv, we had in our minds the idea that there could be medRxiv, but it was really a question of okay, you go from physics, computational science, and math to biology, different community, you acclimatize them, and then medicine, clinical work, things with real world applications, immediate real world applications is like another step. So what we said with bioRxiv was nothing clinically actionable. That was the thing with bioRxiv. And then I think it was about 2015, we saw an article in the New York Times by Eric Topol and Harman Krumholtz, who'd seen bioRxiv and were saying we should do this in medicine. So we started a conversation with them, and sort of long story short, a few years later, we end up collaborating with Harlan and colleagues at BMJ to launch medRxiv. But the idea is that this is slightly different from bioRxiv. The process is slightly different because there's clinical information, because there are concerns. So it does it does operate a little bit differently. Harlan describes it as having higher guardrails. More papers are turned away. There are things we scrutinize in papers for medRxiv that bioRxiv and arXiv certainly don't. When you've got issues around information about patients, the kind of concerns about what constitutes something that would be dangerous. We had like a big list of the sorts of things that we wouldn't post. So the rejection rate is higher, and it can be something can be turned away because we're concerned about it might have identifiable patient information, for example, or it could mislead in a way that might cause detrimental changes in behavior that constitute a public health risk, and that's sometimes a little tricky of a decision to make. But we all know what happened with the Andrew Wakefield paper at the Lancet. So it's trying to avoid things like that, and it's the kind of what is this paper? What if this paper is wrong? What could happen if this paper is wrong? Because we're not making any judgment as to whether something is right or wrong. So there's a few things like that, and of course those became particularly acute concerns during the pandemic, where there were a number of these hypotheticals that we had to worry about. We'd worried about biosecurity, and then suddenly it was like, okay, there's a lot of people now, more people than ever are doing experiments on this one virus. What happens if somebody's doing something dangerous? What does biosecurity concerns look like? And treatment claims. One of the things that we worried about were runs on medicines, on over-the-counter medicines. And if suddenly somebody makes a claim that this thing cures COVID, and then everybody goes and buys it, and then the people who need it for what it's really meant for don't have it. And that, I mean, there were some things that I think that happened with famotidine, not as a consequence of any medRxiv papers, but there were some examples of that. And of course, everybody knows the crazy ivermectin stuff.
Mm. So you mentioned quite rightly the need for checks and controls, but of course every check and every control has to be funded in some way. So if we sort of go back to the 50,000 feet sort of view, how are preprint servers funded? I mean, are they sustainable?
Yeah, well, so currently we're funded by philanthropy. We have, we've had support from Cold Spring Harbor, from the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative and the Sergey Brin Family Foundation. And then there's a number of other institutions. We have contributions from Stanford and various other US and UK and European institutions. So, I mean, that's how they're funded. I think the thing that I always come back to is that at a per paper level, the costs are tiny. So, I mean, it costs a few $1 million a year to run bioRxiv and medRxiv, which seems like a lot of money until you consider that it's an $8 billion industry publishing. It's really change found behind the sofa level sums. So, one ought to be, we can have long discussions about article processing charges for journals in the thousands and how people cover the costs of those, and the extent to which there should be an obligation on the author, etc. If the research is costing hundreds of thousands, does it, and that's a conversation that's been going on for 20 years. But my argument has always been preprints cost tens of dollars, and we absolutely ought to be able to find a way to do that. And we can have all the conversations about how you fund the rest of publishing, but that was essentially when I and John and Mike Eisen wrote the Plan U document. It was really to make that point that the community ought to be able to fund this. I mean, I often make the point that running bioRxiv and medRxiv, the budget for those is less than the budget for some individual investigators at large research institutions. So it really is a tiny amount of money, but n times a small amount of money is still significant. So you do have to find a few $1 million. But I think we've been able to do that so far. And one of the things about the organizational change that we're undergoing now is to try and put in a structure that allows us to create a long-term sustainable approach to obtaining that funding, so that in contrast to a journal, a preprint server can be free for everybody to read and free for everybody to post and use, and because that does make a huge difference, obviously.
Let's go on to new developments in scholarly communication, which I think is where you've become increasingly prominent. In 2024, I think you wrote an excellent overview of the whole sort of journal publishing sort of history and how we've got to where we are today, and new models. And one of the developments that you've been associated with is the publish, review, curate model. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess, the publish, review, curate is a sort of rather specific instance that's advocated by, I think that phrase originally came out of discussions between HHMI and eLife. I think, to me, that's a manifestation of a broader point that I made about preprint servers, which is that once the thing that preprint servers fundamentally do is that they decouple the process of dissemination of something, the paper, and its subsequent evaluation. So, that means that you can put something on a preprint server and then you can put it in a journal. But it also means that you can put it on a preprint server and just leave it there and not do anything else. Or it also means you can talk to all the people who are doing evaluation and want evaluation to change and say, well, you have the freedom to experiment and change and do different things. So what should, if the work has been disseminated, what does peer review look like? And so one of those manifestations is publish, review, curate, which is you put something on a preprint server, then another group of people come along and do the peer review, and then another group of people come along and curate it in some way. That last bit is still a bit sort of vague in the PRC model, but it's all thinking about if you know that the work has been disseminated, if that has been accomplished by a preprint server, then how would you, in the age of the web, think about how you assess it, how you verify aspects of it, how you validate aspects of it, and how you evaluate them? And right now, that's for historical reasons, basically, since the sort of 1960s, this has been, it's been peer reviewed, and we're kind of a bit vague about what that means. And I think a lot of people are unclear about the actual process, but we now have an opportunity to really think about what should we be doing in terms of evaluating and verifying information, and critically, there's a lot of claims of validation and verification that have been made historical, which are absolutely not validation or verification. I mean, I always want to be very clear, that is not what peer review is doing. But I think we can probably further decouple that and do things like say, there are issues around what is the provenance of the data? Is that really the relevant data to the paper? And so maybe there are kind of verification and validation steps you can do. And then there's the peer review process, which is essentially, what do other people think of this? How does it hold up? Where are the strengths and weaknesses? And how do we perform that type of evaluation? And then further downstream, how do people use that as a basis to make their own decisions about the quality of the work, or make their decisions about whether they want to read it in the first place? Because that's one of the things that I think we really have to understand with the current peer review process is it's doing a number of different things. It's potentially, depending on the extent to which you trust the signal that's being sent, it's potentially telling you that you can have some confidence in this work. But I suppose most academics will tell you, well, I want to read it, and then I will tell you whether or not I have confidence in it. But given you have a few million papers potentially to read, another thing that it's doing is it's giving signals as to whether or not you want to read it in the first place. And so one of those strong signals is the journal name. I mean, lots of people will pay attention to a paper in Nature. They won't pay attention to it in the journal you've never heard of. We can argue about whether or not that's the right way to do things, but that is a filter. And then the other thing that is used is there's a sort of post hoc pyramid of assessment where people are using these very same signals to decide whether or not somebody's a good scientist or not. And that is, I think it's something that people find very, very problematic, but it is deeply, deeply embedded in the academic community. I mean, when I was at the LMB, back doing my PhD, there was a lot of tenure track people who had 5 years before they had to make tenure, and the phrase that they used to say in common parlance there was 2 cell papers equals tenure. And there's some version of that has been deeply embedded in academia for quite a long time. And I think lots of organizations, funders in particular, and a lot of scientists really worry that is essentially corrupting the scientific process and hiring in particular, because it just becomes a goal. So I think one of my hopes is that the sort of decoupling I'm talking about allows people to think more about evaluation and think more about what is the basis for assessing people.
Don't you think the decoupling model starts to sort of reduce the role of the journal, or maybe it's a good thing that it reduces the role of the journal?
I think it does. I think some people sort of say, "Oh, we hope journals will go away." I think that the pressure on the system to find ways of filtering and evaluating people means that there's always going to be, in publish, review, curate model, there's still this curate. So who's going to do the curation? It wouldn't surprise me if the things that end up doing curation ending up end up looking a bit like journals. I guess I would turn the question around a little bit and say, if you were going to start a journal today or something like a journal, and you knew every single paper that you were going to publish was already on bioRxiv, would you create a website to put the paper? I mean, it would seem like a huge waste of money when you could just point to it. And I think so. I think it's what does that curation step look like? And it's in that sort of PRC model. We do see things like Review Commons, which is an independent peer review service. So what happens with that, for example, is you put your paper on bioRxiv, then Review Commons, you go to Review Commons, nothing to do with bioRxiv. Review Commons do the peer reviews for you. And then you take them to a journal and say, well, do you want my paper based on these? So at that point, if you're the journal, like, okay, well, I haven't published the paper, I haven't even organized the peer review because Review Commons are doing, what am I doing? I'm doing curation. And so it'll be interesting to see whether there's further evolution downstream. And there are other people who do curation beyond Review Commons, etc. So I think that's there may be I can kind of envisage a scenario where the world changes quite a lot, and all the people who hate journals think that they've won, and all the people who like journals also think they've won because they both claim the thing that's big. Maybe that's a fanciful idea, but I don't think anybody really knows. I do think there's a big opportunity though to make decisions about how we evaluate papers and people, and get away from some of the really problematic aspects, which I don't think anybody denies.
Well, one of the unsatisfactory aspects of the present system is I've been involved recently in institutional repositories, and one of the green open access system is, although it it provides a solution and it makes articles available, it represents a substantial cost on the part of institutions, because every paper is being published essentially twice and curated twice and edited and uploaded twice. So, do you think the green OA system is satisfactory?
I don't. It's a hard one. I mean, when I come with a big sort of conflict of interest in a weird way, because I think if you're building an institutional repository, and you're spending a lot of time and money providing a place for a paper that's free on bioRxiv in perpetuity, it might be easier just to build a website that just has a list of links to papers on bioRxiv. And we've done this actually. If you look on bioRxiv, we have these things called channels where institutions can group all the papers from their initiative that are on bioRxiv, and that's a much easier way of doing that than having to build an institutional repository. If you can just identify all the papers on bio, I'm not dissing institutional repositories. I think they have very important roles in the grey literature, but that specific question, it's interesting to see how we've solved the problem for other people without them having to build infrastructure, because the paper's on bioRxiv, it's permanent, it has a DOI, and it's archived in perpetuity, long-term preservation ensured by Portico, which is something that libraries are really think about. So you don't have those kinds of concerns. So I do think there's a role. I'm not convinced that every institution should have an institutional repository that they maintain at vast expense merely to keep duplicate copies of something that's on a preprint server, for example.
Let's look at some wider aspects of the area, looking outside of life science for a moment. And one of the interesting things about preprints is that you mentioned bioRxiv was the sort of the preprint for biology and medRxiv for medicine, and to some extent that's happened with other areas. So you've got SSRN for social science and RepEc for economics, and arts and humanities doesn't seem to have any preprint servers. But do you think there's a one-size-fits-all model, or do you think there will be more subject-based preprint servers in the same way?
Yeah, I think it is interesting. It's always amusing to me in that there was one archive until there was bioRxiv in 2013, and then suddenly, there was this kind of like explosion of people, and the extent to which there's been successful in different areas has been wildly variable. So I think that's an important thing to think of. I mean, one of the the major motivation really for bioRxiv and archive, but bioRxiv in particular, from our point of view, was that getting the information out much more quickly was really important and could only benefit science. So we know that it takes whatever it is about a year on average to get a paper published, and the benefits to having disseminated that work to all the people who can start working on it immediately a year before are self-evident. I mean, I know people who say, I'm 2 years ahead of my research because I read these preprints. Where would I, it's like somebody once said, if you don't want to keep up with a field, then don't read preprints. Which, so every scientist, even the ones who don't post preprints themselves, they read them when they're in that field. They need to know that. So that's, and and the pandemic made that very, very clear. So many people working on COVID and SARS-CoV-2 were very, they could not imagine how that science would have proceeded without preprints. So if you have that in mind, then you think about, okay, where are some of the areas where there hasn't been such widespread adoption? And I think of a historian friend of mine who writes books and papers on Machiavelli. I'm not sure he cares too much about an 8-month delay to the work getting out. So I think we need to think about that a little bit more in the speed with which the revision process, the evaluation process, and how important it is. It's obviously very clear in biomedical science where you think that things will move much much faster, and there's a kind of an imperative to preprint. I would say I'm not convinced that exists in other fields in the same way. And also with certain types of content. I mean, one of the things we don't have review articles on bioRxiv, for example. There's a number of reasons for that that one could go into, but one of them is that we're probably not missing out. The community is probably not missing out by having thousands more review articles on bioRxiv, because it's not the research. That's more kind of like commentary and evaluation. So I think there are nuances to. I don't think everything needs to be a preprint, and I don't think every discipline necessarily needs to do it in the same way. I mean, works in the humanities are kind of creative works in a different way, whereas most research papers are in biomedical science. They're really an advertisement for some data that you think makes you conclude something, which is that's slightly different. I don't think that's the same as articles in necessarily in English or languages.
You might think that even within life sciences that the content is interoperable, but one of the peculiarities of scholarly publishing is the lack of interoperability. Pretty much every publisher has a different flavor of XML, and when you try to pull all that content together, it's a mighty job to try and to get interoperable content. Do you think there's a future for interoperability through the increasing use of preprint servers, or is there some other way of doing it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that interoperability is definitely one of the things that we're very concerned about. One of the very nice things that we've done early on is these what we call B2J and J2B, which are bioRxiv to journal and journal to bioRxiv workflows. So you can submit a paper to bioRxiv, and once you've completed it, go on to one of more than 300 journals, just send all the files through, and that's interoperable. J2B goes the other direction. So if you submit a paper to PLOS or eLife, and you click the button saying, "Can you put my paper on bioRxiv later today?" They will do that. So I think that's very, very important. I mean, I, like you, have experienced the kind of, we all thought that XML, even JATS XML, was all the same until you have to do something like do a PubMed Central deposit, and they tell you all the aspects in which it wasn't quite the flavor of XML they wanted and why. But I mean, I think anybody who works on standards will sort of say plus ça change, I suspect there. But I think we can. Yeah, I think one of the things that one of the tensions is that arXiv has shown for many, many years that lots of scientists are fine with just having a PDF made by the author. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have sort of very kind of like sort of well-constructed JATS XML and all sorts of discussions about how that presentation of an article and data could actually work in an ideal world. And I think there's a conversation to be had about, where you should really aim between those two poles, because there are physicists who will say, I don't care about any of your JATS XML. I just want, just give me the PDF where at least I can read the equations properly. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there are people who say, we really need very well structured information for text mining, etc. And that's one of the reasons bioRxiv and medRxiv have big text mining repositories where all the XML is in one place, so people can do that. But the conversation is changing with the advent of LLMs, and so I think it's I'm always a little bit wary of trying to be a futurist in this scenario, mainly because I've over the past sort of 20-25 years, I've had so many people confidently predict where publishing is going, and then by the time I get back to them and say you were wrong, they seem to have vanished.
Another question, another part of the scholarly landscape, which is not something that we perhaps any of us intended to happen, but it's there, and there's a question mark over its future, is Google Scholar. Every academic uses Google Scholar, but there's no guarantee that Google Scholar will be in existence in the next 10 years. So what do you think is likely to happen to it?
I don't know. I mean, I know Anurag Acharya very well, and I know his team are very dedicated to it. I think, I mean, I know there have been concerns with both at Google about Google and elsewhere about things that have vanished. I mean, there was Microsoft Academic doesn't exist anymore. Meta doesn't exist anymore. There've been a number of things like that. Google Scholar, I think, is very critical. I do think it's problematic that people are so dependent on one thing. That worries me a little bit. When it's like you said, I mean, I don't think Google are going to pull the plug, but they could. But I mean, GitHub, I don't think Microsoft are going to pull the plug on GitHub, but they could. I do think there's some of these things that people take for granted, and perhaps they shouldn't. I mean, PubMed is one. I mean, we've seen a lot of changes in what the US government have online and what they're funding recently, and I'm beginning to see people say, is that something? Are NLM resources things that we've taken for granted for so long? Should we take them for granted in the way we do? So yeah, I mean, I think that bigger picture is pretty important. And that's one of the things that informs our views on bioRxiv and ensuring it's, that's why we have long-term preservation with Portico. That's why we're trying to develop this sort of long-term sustainability for it.
You mentioned LLMs, and it's difficult to have a conversation without talking about Gen AI. AI is used in all sorts of areas in academic publishing for summaries and literature reviews and so on. Where do you think it could most effectively be deployed?
Oh, that's a difficult one. I mean, well, one area where it clearly, I mean, I think the problem is everywhere you think it can be effectively deployed, you immediately think of ways in which that's problematic. But I mean, there's undoubtedly one way where it's incredibly effective, which is helping non-native English speakers. I mean, for good or for bad, we are in a situation where the language of science and the language of the web are both English. When I was a kid, I lived in France. I spent a year in South America. I know what it's like to be in a situation where the dominant language is not one that is your native language. And I mean, I'm always amazed at how well non-native speakers do and how much better they are at speaking English than a lot of my American and British colleagues, frankly. But that's not universal, and it's particularly difficult for people who come from countries where they already have to speak two languages. So English is their third language. And so, I think LLMs are pretty good at that. I think everybody agrees that that can be really, really helpful.
Mm.
And if we can get if we can get to a kind of like more equitable place on the language issue, then I think that's an undoubted good. And it feels like we're already getting there.
Looking back over your career to date, just to conclude, what are you most proud of in what you've done in your career to date?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. Well, I mean, I think I think bioRxiv and medRxiv um, were pretty important. Just because I think I mean, I think that's the things that scientists really value, and I think that one of the things that really brought that home to me was I was talking to a friend of mine, and she was saying that some of her PhD students and postdocs are astounded to find that there was a time when there was no bioRxiv, and it's kind of like I was like, wow, that's pretty amazing. And they're like, well, what you mean you had to wait like a year to read all this stuff till it be, they were kind of incredulous. And it reminds me of kind of conversations sort of 10, 15 years ago when I'd explain that when I was doing my PhD, I had to walk down the corridor to the end of the floor at the LMB and pick up copies of Oncogene and Journal of Biological Chemistry to see what had come out in my field that month, and use silver platter CDs to do so. I mean, and then people are like, oh, they're incredulous about a time when the literature was not all online. And so there was some echo of that when she described this sort of incredulity from her students and postdocs about how things work before bioRxiv. So I think I think one's got to think that it's been a good thing because of that. So I think either that or there's been since we launched bioRxiv and medRxiv, there've been a few slings and arrows, and I think our ability to withstand that. I'm probably more proud of that, maybe because I didn't think I would be able to do that and still keep my mouth shut.
Let's hope, as well as slings and arrows, you'll come up with some new innovations in the coming years that will keep us all sort of astounded and impressed with what you're doing. Thank you, thank you, Richard, for that sort of fascinating glimpse into your background and for the time spent this afternoon.
Thank you very much. It was very enjoyable.